Hi, Vlad. Hi, everybody. Great to be here and on this creative format. I'm going to start sharing slides. I know we are all day long on timing, so here we go. So as Vlad said, I want to talk to you about serendipity in transforming ideas into products. And as Vlad just mentioned in this discussion with Michael, the creativity is not just ideas, it is doing and the process of something coming into life. And as we look at what creativity researchers do, there is a big part about studying creative thinking and a lot of studying of divergent thinking, how do we evaluate ideas, and then similar topics of how different factors like mood or idea order are reflected in this creative thinking. Another aspect of our study is creative potential. So there we study personality traits. Divergent thinking is this overlap of cognitive potential. We have longitudinal studies that are collecting overall ratings of creative potential of people in their 20s, following them for decades afterwards. And another thing that we are studying is creative products or achievements, something that is done. And what are the attributes of those things that are done and completed. And we have the model of 4C creativity model. We have distinctions between radical and incremental creativity. We have Sternberg's propulsion model of creative contributions. So we have all of these things, but what I see is this gap between potential, something that could come into being, something that is a possibility, waiting for realization, and that moment of realization of something tangible or relatively tangible in your hands or a performance. What happens in between? And I'm very curious in that process of in-between process. And the idea that creativity takes courage is not a particularly original one. Matisse was very pointed in saying it in those words. And research recently has looked at the idea of risk-taking, willingness to take risks in doing that first step in creativity. So starting somewhere, starting the doing process. And as we look at this idea of going from potential to products, I want to use an analogy. So imagine the very concrete potential, something material, block of marble, grapes. And ideas are, what are those things still inside our heads that could be done with it? But there's a difference between having those ideas and actually having something that we can use or something that is out there in the world. And to get from that idea to the process, it's oftentimes creative and long-lasting thing that has to be addressed. So what happens there? How does it happen? And I will argue that this process, the in-between process, is a process of self-regulation. And if we unpack it some more, we start answering questions, well, what is it? What is that makes it happen? And recently, in the last 10 or so years, this idea of grit has been big in the popular culture and in educational studies. So a question was, well, is it the grit? Is it this persistence and sticking with it, sticking with an idea and not kind of being very starting and going and giving up? And it turns out it's not grit. So that's a very simple answer. We did a number of studies, no matter how we looked at it, it's just not it. So then, okay, what is it? And I find this process of breaking it down of what it is a very intriguing one. We know that creativity starts with their basis for creativity. They are domain specific skills and traits, they are general skills and traits that are the basis of it. But then the process itself starts with that impetus, that moment of courage to get started. Then we have a bunch of ideas like that divergent thinking. We have selection of ideas, picking something to start, and then we have to really jump over hurdles, and many hurdles on the way. Throughout this process, there's this regulation. We have to keep going somehow, and that is a highly emotional process. There are difficulties. Difficulties are by definition frustrating. We have to somehow manage that and manage it in order to persist, and also use emotions that happen in the process in the service of getting to something that we are after, getting to performance or a product or some kind of creative outcome. And as we unpack it further, what I will argue is that there are two groups of processes. One is a process of revising and re-strategizing as creativity is being done, undone, and redone. And those include problem finding and adjusting the approach constantly throughout the creative process. Sometimes people think of problem finding as something that is in the beginning of the process and in the beginning of the process alone. It is not. It is a process long endeavor. And then we have to manage our goals. And Michael has been talking about that sometimes they change. Sometimes our questions change, ideas change. That is exactly this process of revising and re-strategizing. The other part of the self-regulation is sustaining effort. We are here, probably most of us here are researchers of one sort or another, and you know how long it takes from an idea to doing studies, to writing proposals, to writing manuscripts, and then the very dreaded revisions. It's a long process, and we have to sustain the process. If you are like me, chances are that you want to quit at some point, but probably you also don't quit. How does this happen? We have to maintain our confidence that we can do it despite reviewer two. We have to persist in this jumping over the obstacles, and again, the managing of the emotions throughout the process. That doesn't mean making yourself feel happy as much as happiness is discussed in relation to creativity. I think that's a very wrong question, but I can talk to you about that at some other time. But managing emotions in the service of creativity. And something that is not discussed enough, I believe, in our community is that this is not something that happens in a vacuum. We are social beings. There are social supports and barriers throughout this process. And one thing that we are very explicitly talking about in this day-long process and exploration is how and where serendipity happens here. My argument is that it happens most prominently in this process of starting, getting the courage to get that first step out, and then in the process of revising, re-strategizing those ideas that happen and that questions change, and in the process of social supports and overcoming the barriers as we are working towards something. And I want to illustrate that with examples. So it was really wonderful listening to Michael's presentation because there were a bunch of examples that are case studies, and I'm going to use a similar approach here to illustrate these different parts of how serendipity comes into the different areas. And I hope that inspires future questions with different methodological approaches. of addressing our questions and challenging us to study it in different ways. So take the first part of where serendipity comes into play. The part where we are thinking of the problems and what the problems are. This is probably the only quote you're ever going to hear me quote from B.F. Skinner. So it's kind of exciting in that way. But it's a quote I really love a great deal. It says a first principle not formally recognized by scientific methodologists, and probably himself the most, when you run into something interesting, drop everything else and study it. You are running into something interesting. You did not plan to run into something interesting. Something happens that you run into it. You have to recognize it. And then you need to have the courage to say, this is important. I'm going to drop other things that are going on. And each of these components have to happen for people to embrace those potential opportunities. They could be opportunities, but on every of those steps, they can break apart. And another example is the one with a process. What happens as you are working on an idea or something that is attempting to come into being, and it might not be working, or you might not be happy with it, or you're looking for something else. That openness, we always talk about openness to experience as a personality trait, something that you have, but openness to experience is also in the moment attribute, where you are open to seeing things, open to recognizing what they could contribute, and then taking those opportunities and turning them from possibilities into something concrete. So as I was very actively thinking about this presentation in the last few weeks, I happened to visit the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine. And it has a substantial collection of the Wyeths. This is from Andrew Wyeth. And he described how he came to do this painting. So this is what was happening. The picture evolved in a strange way. I had wanted to paint my wife, Betsy, picking blueberries. I completed a number of drawings, but nothing worked. It was just someone picking, sort of trite. I really struggled, but got nowhere until I decided to hide. So he's creating that opportunity. I sneaked along the edge of the woods and found her sleeping. I made a quick drawing. As I finished it, I could hear thunder way off in the direction of East Waldoboro. Suddenly, out of the grass, popped our dog Rattler's head, his ears up, cocked, hearing those distant sounds. The sky had that yellowish cast it gets before big storms. All of a sudden, I realized that there was too much face. I painted in the hat. That made a picture. So there was this long process going on. There was an openness of realization that it wasn't working, an openness and a desire to try to create or engineer opportunities for serendipity, hiding in the vicinity, and then noticing things, being open and taking those details that end up creating the final product. So this is an example of that re-strategizing, adjusting, problem finding, and noticing in the process of creation. And my final example, I want to share with you something that is more social in nature. And I wonder whether any of you recognize this lady, Lena Richard. In relation to liking art, I really like to eat, and I really like podcasts. So I heard this podcast from the Smithsonian about Lena Richard. She published this book. This is the cover of her book, New Orleans Cookbook, in 1939. Now, you are from all over the world, as I can see, but this is the time of the segregated American South. This is the time very dangerous for African Americans. And she is in the South, in New Orleans, and she is publishing a major cookbook. She is an executive chef in a major New York restaurant right after publishing this book and gaining major traction, becoming a celebrity chef, what we would say in today's terms. And in 1949, she is the first African-American person to have her own TV show, cooking show. Now, it doesn't get bigger than this, right? So how did this happen? It shouldn't have been possible to happen. Well, she started what we would call her culinary career at age 14. Her mom was a domestic servant in a rich New Orleans family, and she was assisting at age 14. One day, the cook, a random event, one day the cook was sick, and she ended up being tasked to make a family meal. And it just happened to be the case that the lady of the family was very open-minded for the time and recognized Lena's potential, not only recognized it and asked her to be the chef in the family, but also sent her to culinary school. Now, this wasn't easy. It was very difficult. She was sent to Boston, and she had to get, it was a women's culinary school. She had to get explicit permission from every other white girl in the class to be there. She still had to eat in a separate room, even though it was in Boston, in the North. But she went through the process and published her book and became a celebrity chef with this serendipitous social support and taking that social opportunity. And in my conclusion, I want us to think, what are the lessons for creativity here? And I would summarize it as creativity comes from expecting the unexpected, working with that unexpected, recognizing and working with it, which then might result in the unexpected. There, I'm going to open up for, hopefully we have a few minutes for questions. Of course, that doesn't happen all the time. And of course, sometimes there's just last minute panic and we roll. I just happen to like this cartoon a great deal. I would like to say thank you to you all. Thank you to Vlad and Wendy for the moderation and for the invitation. Thank everybody, and here is my contact information.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Zorana. A round of virtual applause, but very real at the same time.